Welcome to Innovating the Future, Key Medtech Trends Shaping Medical Device Industry. I'm very excited to partner with SciLife to join the Smart Quality Summit of 2024. My name is Jennifer Mascioli-Tudor, and I'm the founder and CEO of JMT Compliance Consulting. I have over 20 years of experience leading quality and regulatory teams at different companies, small, medium, and large, focused primarily in the medtech space. Today, we're going to cover 6 learning objectives. The first is understanding FDA's Quality Management System Regulation, otherwise known as QMSR. We're going to explore the latest cybersecurity requirements for medical devices. We're going to gain insights into the laboratory-developed tests. We're going to talk about how artificial intelligence is transforming the medical device landscape. We're going to learn best practices for staying compliant in the medtech sector. And we're also going to close by talking about how to prepare for FDA audits and other critical regulatory requirements. Let's get started. We're first going to start with FDA's QMSR updates. For background, earlier this year, on February 2nd, 2024, FDA announced the Quality Management System Regulation, or QMSR, amending the 21 CFR Part 820 and incorporating the ISO 13485 2016 standards. The intent for this harmonization is to really simplify. If we think back about when the Quality System Regulation was first introduced, this was introduced in 1996. So from 1996 to present, there hasn't been a lot of updates on the FDA side. However, there have been a lot of transformation around different international regulatory requirements. So the intent here is to harmonize and simplify for medical device companies. As I'll get into shortly, modifications for compliance. So as we are familiar with ISO 13485 and the current Part 820, they're substantially similar. So essentially, the QMSR is going to modify it to ensure full compliance with regulatory requirements. So again, the intent here is to harmonize. We as manufacturers have 2 years from the February 2024 implementation date. So from 2024 to February 2nd, 2026, we essentially have a 2-year transition timeline. And we're already almost 3/4, at least in 2024, of the transition period. So if this is something that's applicable to you and you have not started this evaluation and transition, it really behooves you as an organization to really look at this and understand the implications. FDA inspections and ISO certifications, the QMSR does not change the FDA's inspection authority, and ISO 13485 certification will not exempt manufacturers from FDA inspections. So again, it's business as usual. FDA will come in and inspect, and you have to continue, if you're ISO certified, to go through your regular ISO certification audits. If you're already ISO 13485 2016 certified, the impact of the QMSR will be minimal, although I'll highlight some of the key changes. This is really going to be most impactful on US markets that are really only focused on the US, and they have not essentially gone through an ISO 13485 certification. So again, if you're ISO 13485 certified, the impact is minimal. But if you have not sought out your 13485 certification and you're really only focused on the 21 CFR per 820 requirements, there's going to be a significant lift as you go through the transition activities between now and 2026. So as we think about the quality system regulation, and to the left is the quality system subsystem. So everyone should be somewhat familiar with everything around the management boxes. So we have corrective and preventive action, production and process controls, equipment and facility controls, so on and so forth. So this is the anchor that we are most familiar with as we think about the quality system regulation. When we think about why now in terms of transition, as I mentioned previously, it aims to align with the international standard and supports the FDA's objective of promoting international regulatory harmonization. And when FDA did an analysis, it estimates that harmonization will save medical device companies roughly $440 million over the next decade. So there's a lot of benefits to transitioning to the QMSR today. As we'll come to find out, the proposed rule removes most of the contents of the existing 21 CFR per 820. So if you're used to carrying around your little pocketbook that describes the 21 CFR per 820 requirements, and you're used to the ISO 13485 2016 requirements, these are now being merged together. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, FDA's intent was to leverage the ISO 13485 standard as much as possible so we don't have any redundancy across the space. So if we look on the left, 21 CFR 820 was a standalone list of requirements. As we move to QMSR, we're going to have new requirements defined by FDA and also the ISO 13485 2016 requirements. So again, we're moving from a very standalone kind of siloed set of requirements into now this harmonized world with making sure that we're looking very prescriptively at the ISO 13485 standard. What we'll see, this is a visual showing 21 CFR per 820 old, so the quality system regulation. As I mentioned, everything was standalone within the 21 CFR 820. As we move to QMSR now, we're starting to see incorporation by reference, deleted, reserved for future editions. So there's some comments that FDA has made to help industry really understand the future state of QMSR. And so essentially, we're seeing a lot of incorporation by reference and really leveraging ISO 13485. We'll go into a couple new standards or requirements that's defined as part of QMSR, but these are very minimal in nature. One of the key differentiators between the quality system regulation and the quality management system regulation really centers around risk management. So if you're familiar with the 21 CFR, risk management was really sort of centered around design control. As we know, ISO 14971 talks about risk management throughout the entire product life cycle. FDA is moving to that philosophy as well. And so again, risk management, if you are only manufacturing in the US and you've really only centered around design controls from a risk perspective, this will be one of the biggest lifts in terms of making sure that not only are you compliant with ISO 13485 from a risk perspective, but also making sure that you're compliant to 14971. When we look at the preamble, and the preamble is all of the comments, all of the discussion that happened prior to releasing the regulation from an FDA perspective, the risk is mentioned 36 times in the preamble. And as a side note, I'd highly recommend you to become familiar with the preamble. There's a lot of really rich information in terms of how FDA came to define and finalize this regulation. And risk is mentioned 32 times in ISO 13485. So as we know, risk is a closed loop, entire product lifecycle requirement. It's not just part of one system of your quality system regulation. It's really looking at the whole life cycle. So this is now a requirement as we move into quality management system regulation. The other thing I'll just quickly highlight is we are all used to the terms DMR, DHF, DHR. This will now be transitioned to a term called medical device file. This is something that was already noted in the ISO standard, but FDA is moving to this terminology as well. I also want to highlight that for those of us that have hosted inspections, we have historically not been required to show management review, presentation, internal audit reports, supplier audit records, so on and so forth. This exemption is now going away. So just something to consider as you plan for transition. If you have any documentation or notations in your documentation or processes that state this, you have to make sure you remove them because now all of this is open to FDA inspections. We're now going to move on to cybersecurity. As we look at the evolving regulatory landscape, there are so many things that are coming at us. And I want to talk about some of the hot trends that we're seeing and key considerations as you're thinking about putting together perhaps a submission to FDA. So in 2023, FDA issued a document called Cybersecurity and Medical Devices Quality System Considerations and Content of Pre-Market Submissions. This is important because prior to this, it was a little less prescriptive in terms of what agencies or what manufacturers had to submit as part of 510K submissions. FDA is now really fine-tuned expectations and making sure that as you're thinking about submissions, that you're weaving this into your product development lifecycle and making sure you're considering all of these elements early enough in your cycle so you're ready for submission. So as we think through and look at what this guidance talks about, it's new requirements that apply to device manufacturers that apply for FDA approval. And keep in mind, this is for connected medical devices. So certainly if it's not something where a device that you're implementing or submitting to FDA, it's not connected, this obviously doesn't apply. But when we think about connected medical devices and breaches in security and things that we've seen come out recently with respect to news, specifically around connected medical devices, FDA really wanted to make sure that there were some guardrails in terms of how to manage this and how to regulate this. As we think about timeline, any FDA submission prior to October 1st, 2023 will not inherently be issued a refuse to accept. And if you're not familiar with a refuse to accept, this is part of the administrative review for your 510(k) submission. It usually happens within the first 15 days. And so again, in order for you to get to your substantive review as part of your FDA submission, you have to make sure you make it through your RTA. So FDA is now saying prior to October 1st, 2023, will not inherently issue an RTA if you don't have all the elements. However, post October 1st, you are now bound to follow these requirements. So if you don't have these requirements embedded as part of your submission, we will issue an RTA. And so really making sure that you evaluate current devices and consider upgrades for updated protection. So although this is post October 1st, 2023, if you want to submit a revision to your on-market device, you have to make sure that you're in compliance to all of these regulations. So even if you haven't done this in the past, you have to make sure that you're planning for the future and embedding these as part of your requirements. As we think about the submission, the 510(k) submission pathway, I just mentioned you submit your 510(k), it goes through your administrative review, is really looking for administrative elements, and so it's not a substantive review. But again, if you get stopped at your 15-day review cycle, you have 180 days to submit a response. But again, you want to try to avoid any stoppage in the clock. So the more prepared and the more robust you are as part of your submission, the more predictability you have in terms of clearance of your device. And the last thing that you want is you go through all of this work and FDA comes back and says it's not substantially equivalent. So what this means is you go through your substantive review, you've submitted all your documentation, FDA has come back with questions and you're not able to address them satisfactorily from an FDA perspective, and they come back and say, look, the file is not an NSC. So that means that you have to go back and do some modifications to your submission. So again, the planning piece as part of your product development lifecycle is critical. Having good awareness of new regulations and guidance documents that are coming down from FDA and international bodies is critical to success. And cybersecurity is one of the key hot topics that we all need to be familiar with. So quickly going through the cybersecurity updates, and this is a very high level summary. I would again recommend, if you're a connected medical device, software as a medical device, go through this with a fine tooth comb and really understand the implications. But the guidance document is applicable to devices that contain software or programmable logic, as well as devices that have a device software function, device within the meaning of Section 201. So again, FDA has really, really great tools and resources. So if you're new to the space and you're not sure if you actually meet the definition of a medical device, go through that exercise. Guidance is not limited to devices that are network enabled or contain other connected capabilities. So again, there are some nuances defined in the guidance document. Again, it behooves every organization to go through this in detail because every device is a little bit different and there might be some nuances specific to your device that aren't more broadly known. So again, really understanding this. And we'll talk a little bit about, if you have questions, there are means to go to FDA to get some of those questions resolved. The expanded scope includes a CBER submission type. So we're CDRH for medical devices. The Center for Biologics now is included. It includes consideration for combination products and added elements associated with requirements under Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The guidance added new subsections in security risk management section to clarify pre-market submission documentation deliverables, including cybersecurity risk assessment and interoperability. and added Appendix 4 to further clarify pre-market submission documentation recommendations. So again, this is an important element to be extremely familiar with. Again, having this insight prior to submission is critical because you don't want to wait until the end to find out that you missed the mark. The other big component is your software bill of materials. Essentially, it's your SBOM framing document, and supporting materials can be separate from the SBOM. So the SBOM is an important document that really needs to be robust and thoughtful. So again, really understanding how you define the process around your SBOM and then how you develop that. Submission types to CDRH, your pre-market notification, de novo, pre-market applications, product development protocols. So these are all submission types now under this guidance document. Considering best practices, cybersecurity is part of the device safety and the quality system regulations. So these are not optional or nice to have, these are required. And designing for security is design in rather than bolt on. So what we've seen in the past is it's sort of an afterthought, or there are things that we think about post full design freeze. Now we're saying, look, we need to design this in early as part of your inputs, outputs of your design control process so that you're accounting for those as part of your verification validation, your labeling practices, all the things that equal your finished medical device. Make sure you're designing in cybersecurity. The other things to consider is threat modeling, cybersecurity risk assessment. This is new. Interoperability considerations. So all of this is very nicely defined in this guidance document. It's, you know, a 50, 60 page document. There's a lot of really good information, but again, it's up to you to tease out the important pieces applicable to your device and incorporate and define that in your own procedures so that it's understandable and implemented as part of your organizational quality management system. Talking about your SBOM, medical device suppliers must also include a software bill of materials containing all commercial, open source, and off-the-shelf software components while complying with other FDA requirements to demonstrate reasonable assurance that the devices and related systems are cyber secure. So don't shortchange the SBOM process. Make sure that you're spending ample time inventorying, defining, and documenting your SBOM. Again, this is a critical part of your submission. We think about the SBOM, it's essentially your ingredient list detailing all software component. And FDA has stated that when providing SBOM information, applicants should look to its guidance documents regarding off-the-shelf software use, medical devices, and cybersecurity for network medical devices. So as a medical device manufacturer, it's not just one guidance documents that you're required to look at. There are branches into other guidance documents. Be familiar with these, make sure that you understand how that translates into your requirements and your quality management system. And again, spend the time up front understanding implications for your business. When we think about cybersecurity testing, recommendations on type testing, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, security requirement testing, threat mitigation, vulnerability testing, penetration testing. Again, these are all things that should be part of your top level test plan as part of your product development lifecycle. If you're not incorporating this in as part of your planning, you will be delayed and likely get a whole bunch of questions from FDA, which will cause further delays. The other thing to keep in mind is you might not be a subject matter expert on this. There are a lot of people who this is their bread and butter. They spend days and days, talk with FDA. They really become subject matter experts in all of these new requirements coming in. Seek those third party and subject matter experts out. I know it might be a little bit more costly, but at the end of the day, they'll be a lot more efficient in being able to tell you specifically what you need. And they'll have also case studies and experiences in terms of perhaps what didn't work and what worked with FDA from a submission perspective. So as we move on to another hot topic, another new development, if you will, in terms of FDA strategy and road mapping, we're going to talk about laboratory developed tests. Again, this happened this year. So on April 29th, 2024, the FDA announced the final rule aimed at helping to ensure the safety and effectiveness of laboratory developed tests. The rule amends the FDA's regulations to make explicit that in vitro diagnostic products are devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, including when manufacturer of the IVD is a laboratory. So for those of you who've been in IVDs and who've done LDTs in the past, this is a huge shift in the marketplace because historically, when you're developing tests, everything was done under the guise of the laboratory regulations. So there's a set of regulations that manages and regulates laboratory developed tests. So this shift to FDA having oversight is causing a lot of, I would say, nervousness across the space. There's a lot of questions. There's still unanswered items that we need to get through. And so there's still a lot of things happening with respect to the LDT regulation. And what it boils down to, the genesis, for those of you that are familiar with Theranos, so this really, if we go back to the Theranos event in 2015, there were a lot of things that happened sort of under, behind the curtains with respect to how those tests were developed. So I think one of the elements of the LDT ruling, the Theranos was a springboard in terms of how are we really regulating these tests? How are we making sure that they're compliant? How are we making sure that we're really putting patient safety at the epicenter of everything that we do? So again, many times when we see new regulations come out from the FDA, it stems from things that have happened historically. And so sometimes it takes them a long time to really digest and process everything. But my sense is that the LDT comes from a lot of things that we've seen over the last 10 years with the laboratory developed tests. And so again, just talking about Theranos, again, the springboard, and we all know the story in terms of what happened post all of this discovery. So FDA is really saying, look, we want to mitigate future events. We want to make sure that we're protecting safety, patient safety. And so our approach here is that we're going to look to regulate this. The other thing, as I mentioned, is there is a lot of controversy. As I mentioned, historically, LDTs have not been governed by FDA. And so the industry is coming up with a whole bunch of questions and concerns with respect to what does this lead to? What are the implications now that FDA is going to be regulating? How is this going to change our agility and our innovation? So there's just a lot of questions in terms of how do we really go about this. So the American Clinical Laboratory Association argues the agency does not have the authority to enforce stricter standards on lab developed tests. So again, we're going to continue to see this disagreement, if you will, in terms of interpretation of requirements, especially when we have clinicians that are involved. So it'll be very interesting to see how this evolves over the next few months or even years. And again, essentially the ACLA argues in the complaint that LDTs are services carried out by the laboratory professionals, and Congress did not grant authority to the FDA to regulate them. So again, I would encourage you to go deeper on this topic. It's very interesting. There's a lot of developments that are happening sort of on a daily basis. So again, it'll be very interesting to see where we land. Similar to the QMSR, there's a transition strategy, a transition timeline. And so the rule was published on May 6, 2024. The FDA establishes a 4-year to 5-stage phase-out policy. And so as we look over over all the stages and over the transition timeline, there's a lot of key milestones that LDT manufacturers need to be aware of. So we have the publication of the LDT ruling. We have stage 1, so medical device reporting, correction and removal, complaint files. So there's a whole bunch of things we have to do on the compliance side. And then as we move across the timeline, May 2026, we have registration and listing. May 2027, we have quality system requirements other than the complaint files, and so on and so forth. So again, if you're an LDT, now's the time for you to start really mapping out the post-market requirements, such as complaint file processes. And so this becomes one of the key entrees in, if you will, to the laboratory developed test shift from an FDA perspective. As we think about the phase-out program, tests that qualify as LDT per FDA's traditional certification, tests that were manufactured by high complexity CLIA certified labs and offered as LDTs by the lab, so these are phase-out. It does not include direct-to-consumer tests, tests intended for donor screening, tests intended for emergency use, and tests manufactured or used outside of a clinical laboratory. And again, this is evolving. So I'm assuming that this list will continue to evolve over the course of the next period of time. FDA will apply a limited enforcement discretion policy for LDTs. These LDTs will not be required to comply with FDA's pre-market review or QSR requirements, but regulatory requirements such as MDR, complaint handling, registration, and listing will apply. So again, if you're an LDT, become very familiar with the phase in program, if you will, all the key milestones as we transition over the next 4 years. Make sure that you understand the implications, inventory, your current product portfolio, have discussions with subject matter experts. And there's quite a bit of information that's being circulated by FDA every single day. So make sure you stay abreast of these changes so that you really understand implications for your business. As we move into AI and medtech, so we've talked about some key changes happening within our space over the next few years. Is there opportunity for us to automate that? How do we become really, really good at making sure that we know how things are evolving across our space? So I wanted to talk a little bit about some regulatory trends and some things that we've talked about. So FDA has moved to an eSTAR, which stands for Electronic Submission Template and Resource Program. So now the required mode for submitting information for a 510K is through eSTAR. So if you have not submitted enough a 510K, let's say in the last 6 months to a year, this is something that's going to be new for you. So really understand implications and plan for onboarding. Make sure you understand the time it takes and the system requirements, so on and so forth, so you're successful. We talked about cybersecurity and really tying cybersecurity to quality and making sure that you're designing it into your product development lifecycle. When we think about technology trends, we have seen a lot of challenges on the supply chain side. So some organizations have created advanced modeling tools that can help evaluate the potential effects of stockouts and other disruptions. So again, becoming more resilient when you think about inventory position, understanding your build and understanding your predictability around supply chain is really a great mitigation to ensure success out in the workplace. So I bring supply chain in because we've seen supply chain shortages. We've seen some organizations shut down only because they couldn't manage the portfolio from a supply chain perspective. So this becomes an important key differentiator to do very, very well. So again, there are tools out there to help with the modeling. Data analytics and AI, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Obviously, we're familiar with it now. We hear probably about AI and data analytics every single day. So there's a lot of tools out there just to help us from a technology perspective. So whether it's imaging, whether it's software as a medical device, and there's also tools that can help us on the regulatory intelligence side and a whole bunch of tools to help us just get more crisp with respect to data that's happening out in the space. So all of this is very exciting. It's still evolving, but there are a lot of tools that you can get your hands on and it doesn't cost too much money to do so. When we think about economic trends, hiring and training, we've heard, at least I've heard, that AI will replace jobs. And my sense is that it will make our jobs different. So for those companies that are investing in employees and investing in training and really giving them exposure and visibility to some of the AI tools, those organizations are going to do really well. It's the organizations that are sort of putting their hands to their ears and saying, not yet, we're not ready. We need to be ready yesterday. And so really making sure that your organization is ready from a training, hiring, competency perspective, again, is a differentiator. Digitizing manufacturing. So I'm sure many of you have either still fully paper-based on the shop floor, or maybe you're a hybrid. Really the wave of the future as we think about manufacturing 4.0 or 5.0 or whatever that term is with respect to digitizing manufacturing is really automating wherever you can within the manufacturing floor to reduce errors, to increase predictability, and it drives better outcomes. So cycle times, scrap costs, manufacturing areas, all these things are benefits to really moving to a digitized manufacturing philosophy. So again, there's a lot of different organizations that are perfecting this. And so go out there, learn, talk to people or talk to organizations who are on this journey or who have done it to really understand how you can bring in best practices to your organization. As we think about therapeutic, there's biowearables. So there's a rise in biowearables and expected to be more meaningful conversations with patients. So the intent is that you can interact with these biowearables. So you get real-time feedback, which is really great from a design perspective, because in some cases, complaint data or field data is lagging. And so in these situations, you can get real-time feedback to then get patient access data quicker, and really then feed that information back to the organization to figure out how we can optimize and how we can continuously improve. And then connected medical devices, we've talked about this. So connected medical devices are medical devices that are capable of connecting to the internet through Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and radio transmission, real-time patient monitoring, more personalized care, increased safety, privacy, and security. So again, as we talked about cybersecurity earlier, as we evolve from a technology and therapy perspective, FDA really needs to make sure that they're staying connected and staying up to date so that they can regulate these new devices appropriately, because at the end of the day, their mission is around protecting patient safety and health. And so that's where we're going to continue to see evolution with respect to standards and regulations, because technology and innovation is happening so quickly. As we move into how do we stay ahead of the curve, we've talked a lot about things and regulations and trends and topics that have come down the pike. They're already in play. They're already things that we have to be aware of and get compliant to. But how do we stay ahead of the curve to make sure that we're accounting and being proactive in our approach with respect to staying compliant? From an FDA perspective, FDA has done a phenomenal job putting together resources for the public. They created a CDRH Learn, where they're constantly adding free modules on important topics. So if you go to the website, they have a new module they just released on cybersecurity. They have one now on QMSR. They have one on MDSAP. And the list goes on and on. So this really is a great resource for anyone at any stage of company. I really recommend early stage companies to do some due diligence here, especially as you're thinking about submitting your first product to FDA. There's a lot of really good, rich information that you can glean. The other thing FDA does a good job is most of the information is publicly available. So you can search up competitor pre-market notifications or pre-market approval information. So if you want to do some regulatory intelligence and really understand how other companies did it, obviously you won't see everything that was submitted as part of the submission, but you will get a summary, which is really good initial intelligence for you to leverage and bring back to the organization. So again, all this information is public and it's all free. And so if you're not using this today, highly recommend that you become familiar with it and add this to sort of your regulatory intelligence arsenal, if you will. Continuing on, FDA has tools to classify your medical device. There's the manufacturer and user facility device experience database, MOD. So that's where manufacturers are required to submit adverse events. So again, if you're a manufacturer and you have an adverse event that happened in the field, you are required to submit this to the FDA. Similarly, if you want to gather regulatory intelligence on competitor devices, you can look for this product type, you can look for the manufacturer, model number, the list goes on, but it will basically spit out a report and then you can synthesize the data specific to what you're looking for. The other tool that I think is amazing, so if you're not familiar with this, again, this is a bookmark page for sure, is FDA has published a compliance dashboard. And what this allows anyone to do is to look up inspection data, compliance actions, recalls, imports, import refusals, import entry for any listed manufacturer. So if you put in the manufacturer name, it will actually spit out a really nice dashboard. So here is an example. So I put in Philips, and this is the FDA actions and timeline. So if you're looking to put together data for management review, or if you're looking for a report on competitive intelligence, and perhaps your leadership team has said, look, what's happened from a 2-year perspective on Philips, you can actually go into this compliance dashboard and pull out this really, really nice rich data. You can also double click on each icon and it will take you to some specificity with respect to the recall that was issued or the inspection data. It will actually drill down to how many 483s were issued and what the subject or sort of category was for each 483. So again, really, really rich information. If you're not familiar with this, I strongly recommend that you become familiar. Just quickly going through as we think about, again, staying ahead of the curve. If you're not collating 483 information, again, this is all publicly available information. I really encourage you to do this because, again, you might have similar issues and better for you to identify it internally versus FDA coming in and finding it for you and then issuing a 483. So again, it's always really important to do this regulatory intelligence, bring it back to the business, and do your own remediation. So some primary regulatory reasons that we're seeing from a 483 perspective: devices without appropriate marketing submissions or no marketing authorization. From a quality system perspective, these have been pretty consistent over the last, let's say, 10 years. So complaints, supplier controls, CAPA, design. So these are all deficiencies observed as part of these quality management system processes. So again, I highly encourage you to go in, become familiar, and do some due diligence on your own QMS to make sure that these same gaps don't exist. We're going to close this session with FDA audit readiness. So we've talked a lot about essentially kind of the FDA roadmap, some of the FDA hot topics, key considerations as you're preparing for perhaps a 510(k) submission, some technology, digitization, things that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. And then we talked a little bit about things to consider in terms of proactive quality. What tools can you leverage internally? And free tools, by the way, that FDA has published that you can really leverage to enhance your regulatory intelligence roadmap. All of that to say that we are always needing to be FDA ready. We don't want to be FDA ready the day the FDA calls. You always want to be ready for an FDA audit. And so all the things I mentioned helps you prepare for an FDA audit. So just to quickly summarize, your quality system will be reviewed during an FDA inspection. They will be looking at 21 CFR Part 820. To note, they are not going to be auditing us against QMSR until 2026. So just make sure that you're continuing to leverage 21 CFR Part 820. Use internal quality audits to your advantage. So continue to pressure test your own systems internally and take action where needed. Internal auditing is a great way to identify areas of concern and compliance issues and prep your team for the inspection. So again, upfront preparation is really, really important. FDA looks at it from a risk-based audit approach. Firms are identified based on the risk of the device. And a lot of important points is that CDRH and ORA staff may also consider factors like device classification, post-market data, rapidly evolving technology. So again, be prepared, understand your landscape from a risk-based approach, and understand any gaps that you might have within your quality management system and correct them before FDA shows up. Just quickly, there are 3 classifications of devices within the FDA CDRH. Class 1 is the lowest risk, and Class 3 is the highest risk. So again, you want to sort of turn your dial accordingly depending on the risk of the risk class of your device. I mentioned this earlier, but if you want a playbook in terms of how do you actually prepare internally for an inspection, the quality system inspection technique, which is a published guideline by FDA, is a great way to go through and really inspect internally. It goes through each of these sub-elements and has a whole bunch of questions that an FDA inspector would ask you. So again, really good practice. If you haven't done it, strongly encourage that you incorporate this as part of your internal audit practice. So as we think about complaints, I mentioned this, complaints is your entree into everything quality management system. So FDA will likely come in and look at your complaint files, look for trends. And so again, really make sure that you're pressure testing this quality process internally. And the question is, will we be notified of an upcoming FDA inspection or not? Maybe, maybe not. Again, always be ready. Just quickly, so the FDA will arrive, we'll make introductions, we'll do a facility inspection, we'll have a closeout meeting and post-inspection procedures. So again, FDA has published really nice, clear instruction in terms of what to expect when an FDA visits, and then post-audit activity as well. So make sure you're familiar with that whole set of logistics. So as we close, how to prepare, so integrate quality into day-to-day practices, always be prepared to host an FDA inspection, identify your audit team in advance, leverage internal audits. During inspection, do not lie or commit to anything prematurely, and do not get confrontational or sign affidavits. So again, having all of this well set as part of your internal practices is paramount to successful inspections. Just quickly, there are 3 types of inspections: pre-market, routine, and for cause. Again, highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with all these types of inspections, because for US-based manufacturers, this could be something that you have to undergo depending on your device classification. FDA Form 483 is the observational form that's presented at the end of an inspection. Recalls we've talked about, so these are issues that come up if you have to do something to remove or take action on product that's in the field. And then criminal prosecution obviously is worst case, so we want to make sure that everything's intact. And warning letter is if you don't take the 483 seriously, they will issue a warning letter. And consent decree is if you don't respond to the warning letter, consent decree can be essentially the next step. So the important point here is there are significant consequences of noncompliance. Make sure you're staying in compliance. There are some in the news. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail here. Suffice to say that you can look at all of this. This is all publicly available information. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the space right now. Again, really important to be aware of what's happening in the field and then bringing it back to your business. So as we close, your call to action, stay ahead of FDA's quality management system regulation changes. Ensure your devices meet the latest cybersecurity requirements by proactively assessing and addressing vulnerabilities. Stay informed with the evolving LET regulations. Harness the power of artificial intelligence, regulatory intelligence. Stay updated on current industry trends. Always audit ready. Develop a risk management framework. And lastly, but most importantly, foster a culture of quality and continuous improvement and learning. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I hope you found all this rich information valuable. Again, I covered quite a lot of information quickly, but the intent here was to make sure that we covered some of the hot topics that we're seeing within the industry. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A session. Thank you again so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you.